You ever thought about visiting a monastery? It's kind of an interesting experience. We all thought it would be. So we're here today to talk about visiting a Byzantine Catholic monastery. What is that? What goes on there? How's it different from a normal Catholic monastery or anything else? Well, stick around if you want to find out. This is Eric Slawick, aka the UWM Penn guy, and
Alex Burks,
and
Elliot School.
And Elliot, you're kind of the new man on. Well, actually, we have a bunch of stuff we're doing ourselves, but since you're the new man on this format, do you want to spend about 5 seconds explaining kind of who you are and why you're on the Penn Guy podcasts?
Yeah, sure. I'm a student at UWM. I met Eric while he was out handing out his pens. Our first discussion was about 2.5 hours long. And then every single discussion following that was about 2.5 hours long. It's been an absolute joy getting to know him, though.
Likewise. Thank you, friend.
Appreciate that.
Okay. So, in that case, since, well, I don't think anyone's going to be crossing swords today. This is going to be fairly somewhere in the middle. So, Alex, why don't you explain to us what a Byzantine Catholic monastery is?
Sure, Eric. Well, it might help to explain what Byzantine Catholicism is. So if you're in any way familiar with church history, you know about, of course, the Great Schism, 1054, East split from West, Eastern Christianity based in Constantinople, Western Christianity split off into Rome. So these are colloquially, referred to as the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, respectively. But before that point, they were indeed one church. So the Byzantine Catholic movement started in the 15th and the 16th century. So kind of recently in church history, relatively, when we're talking about stuff, it's so old. And it was kind of fruits of efforts in the Holy Roman Empire of Catholics going over and evangelizing Orthodox and bringing them back into union with Rome. And eventually, the church gave them permission to retain everything that made them Eastern Christians. So they maintained their old calendars, they maintained their own hierarchy, maintained their own fast days, so on and so forth down the line, right? So we went to a Byzantine Catholic monastery that is a part of the Hungarian Greek Catholic tradition. So it's a big family tree of these various traditions, but that's kind of just one offshoot that we went to, and it was really interesting because this monastery has influences from the Melkite Greek Catholic Church and the Ruthenian Greek Catholic Church, as well as the Roman Catholic Church. So it's a very interesting place to be, the intersection of many cultures and many different theological inputs. So that is basically what this section of Christianity is all about.
Okay, cool. And there's a lot there to dive into. But Elliot, since you and I were both different degrees of outsiders to this tradition, why don't you get us officially rolling then by kind of giving your thoughts and impressions as a Roman Catholic from what, if I call it the Western Latin Rite, that works, right? Yeah. Who's grown up with the Western Latin Rite? Yeah,
sure. I kind of anticipated that it was going to feel almost like I was a Protestant attending a mass for the first time. Although I have experience with the more traditional like church services as it is, going to the Divine Liturgy for the first time, I really had no idea what to expect. You see clips online of like Orthodox doing their Divine Liturgy. It's a very beautiful showing of a church service. A lot more involved, I would say. A lot more free flowy. Like going in there, everybody kind of does their own thing. They sort of follow the priest or whoever the guy was who was standing at that tall obelisk with the spinny top with all the music on it. So coming from like a Latin Rite mass where it's everybody does the exact same things, says the exact same things, that was definitely a jump between the two. In terms of like how it was said, what was said, very, very similar. But I mean, there was so much bowing, so much crossing. It was beautiful. I think something that especially struck me is like the repetition. They kept on saying, "Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy," and it was very much a mantra. It was sung over and over again, and kind of hearing that. I mean, I asked Alex when we got done, like, why are they saying that over and over again? And what he said really struck me. It's like, if you're not saying "Lord have mercy on me" continually, like, what are you doing? You know, are we not always in need of God's mercy? Beyond that, like looking at all the symbolism and what they do, because when, like at a Latin mass, it's all in front of you. Like there's no veil between the altar and the people, but at the Divine Liturgy, there's a veil and there's people coming in and out of it. So that was something that was totally new to me. Seeing that and understanding the symbolism of it being like the separation between like heaven and earth and the people, and like that veil thinning and like Christ coming down through that so that we can receive him. It was different than a mass, but I think it had a very beautiful element of symbolism and allowed me to kind of unblur the haze that was like going on for the first time going there. And I definitely think that going there a second time would help me grasp it a little bit better, to participate a little bit more, because I was kind of in a tizzy. My mind was always going. I'm like, well, what are they doing? What are they doing this? Well, this guy over here in the corner is like acting like a madman, a very controlled madman. But I'm like, it's very, very foreign to me. But overall, it's beautiful. I mean, I've never seen anything like it.
Cool. So, I mean, I'm kind of the most outsider here, and I would say that. So this would you say you connected with it?
On some levels, yes, but overall, I think it was just so different from what I'm used to. Where I had trouble like really like prayerfully entering into it, because I just didn't know. I didn't know the difference between like behaviors at this at the Divine Liturgy versus a mass.
See, that's interesting, because I'll try to make this as low level as I can. I believe that this was oversold to me in terms of how strange it would be for me. Mm-hmm. Because I was going in expecting some sort of like weird cultic, like almost like demon chants or something. And there was a lot of repetition, but I mean, from my position as the Protestant in the group here, I was actually able to go to sing along with at least half of it. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of an up and down sort of thing, because I'd be rolling along, and I'm not necessarily averse to repetition. And then, of course, it would take one of these right angles, and it would say some. And so I mean, it would go along, and some basically Christian ideas, or just singing the Psalms. And then, they'd interject something about the Virgin caring for her people or whatever it was. And I'd literally like internally kind of like have to be like, whoa, wait, that changed quickly. So, I mean, I have complex views on Mariology and things like that, but I think you guys both understand that, given that I don't believe in its validity, I can't really participate in it. So that was kind of what I was curious about, was because you said it would be like as big of a jump as it was for me to go to mass, especially the TLM Alex and I went to last year, for traditional Latin mass. But I grew up Catholic, so that wasn't nearly as big of a jump as it would have been if I hadn't grown up Catholic and gone straight into this. So, I guess before I just start shooting stuff out, any other thoughts or questions people want to roll out there?
Curious to see what, well, you sold that. You have so many thoughts, Eric. I'm so curious.
I think that in the way of sort of ecumenical dialogue, the fact that first of all, I showed up, and again, probably because this was oversold, and I'm not blaming anyone for that. I understand what people were attempting to do. Not just here, but when Alex and I visited an actual Orthodox church last year, my friends at the Newman Center were all getting me ready for, like, get ready that this is going to be unlike anything you've ever encountered. And I would actually say that was more true of the actual Orthodox church than it was of this. It wasn't as much of a shock as it would have been running into the walls full of icons. There weren't nearly, correct me if I'm wrong, but there weren't nearly as many icons at this church as there would be in a full Orthodox church, right?
Depends where you go. St. Sava's is interesting because they've like the mosaic icons right into the wall. And so it depends because, of course, icons are expensive and the church has to spend many years either commissioning someone to paint them onto the walls or buy them. So it varies.
Okay. Yeah. So even that wasn't as shocking as it might have been because I was kind of prepared for it. But so that was the first thing that I noticed, was that the initial entryway, or whatever it's called, where you kiss the book or sign it or whatever. That was pretty monastic. But then once you get into it, it's basically just like an elaborate house.
Yeah.
That kind of surprised me. I think I had really been prepped to expect like medieval architecture with electricity and running water. So I don't know, Alex, I'll just run through my thoughts here and we can kind of bandy them about. So Alex, do you want to explain why that is? What's their thought behind being that modern and that traditional and how that all layers?
Well, the Byzantines are interesting because they're not, so the idea is that you live simply and you don't obviously exceed what you need in any extreme way, but they're not like Franciscans or like cloistered Carmelites or anything where it's, bare, and they do fast very strenuously, and they're not really people of luxury necessarily, but it's not necessarily like asceticism in as extreme a sense as it would be in certain Western monasteries. So it's a lot more provisional and it's a lot more relaxed. So they actually, the Brothers of Holy Resurrection bought that from a Latin order that was kind of dying out, and so they repurposed it and they built onto it. And it's interesting because it's not very grand, or it's nothing insane to look at on the outside, but it's very kind of homey. And so it's kind of a cozy spot. I don't know. And it works for the monks, and they have enough room to kind of do what they need to do. But it's very much this is what we got. We're going to make it work. We're using, the space to use the space. And they have everything they need as far as a confectionery, a dining room, a kitchen, a chapel, a place to sleep. So it's kind of like, they bought it and they updated it as far as they need to, and they're like, as long as the roof isn't falling in, and we got, like you said, water and shelter and a place to pray, it's kind of like, what else do we really need?
So would you call it a modern sort of version of that idea of, like you said, that like the Apostle Paul says, that food, clothing and shelter therein to be satisfied? Is that what they're trying to embody?
I mean, the basic idea of monasticism is you are intentionally separating yourself from the world in as much as you can in a negative sense. So, of course, being, people where, we are living in the world, we're kind of caught up in a lot of worldly crossfire, so to speak, right? But the monks say, we're taking a step back and we're taking vows. Typically, the vows are poverty, obedience and chastity, right? So they're not going to get married. They're not going to father children unless something goes terribly wrong. They are going to be poor. They're not going to accrue earthly possessions more than they absolutely need. And even the clothes that they do have are ideally communally owned and given to them. And finally, you are going to have a vow of obedience. So you obey your superior, whoever that may be. And it's an election. Whoever gets elected is the abbot. Right now, the abbot is Abona Moses, they call him. So the idea is more like, well, what do we really need to just get by day to day and to focus on living the life kind of laid out in the Gospels?
Okay. Yeah, because this is always part of the reason that I wanted to go was because I don't connect with the monastic idea. And I'm not per se trying to turn this into a debate. I'm genuinely trying to understand. And I think the practicality of it, the fact that they weren't going like full prepper in a, full doomsday prepper in a log cabin helped to show that they're not, I'm not calling preppers lunatics, but like, if you try to do Christian prepping, I think it would take on a dimension that would get cultic very fast.
Mm.
And that, if anything, I was expecting it was that. And like you said, when we arrived at that building and I saw its condition on the outside, I was like, oh, we're to quote Weird Al in Amish Paradise, we're getting real medieval on your hiney here, aren't we? And it's like, and then I got inside, and it's probably what any of us would identify the level of possession and living that we would all kind of agree is the Christian ideal. Not that any of us are suggesting that wealth is inherently sinful, but the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And would we all kind of agree that what we saw there was, for a communal living setting anyways, was, I would probably say is about the ideal?
Yeah, and I see especially there, it was a lot more simple than what I was expecting. Because, I mean, I have the idea of like a more Eastern church, like more of an Orthodox church. And that was not even close. Maybe the same amount of like icons as I expected. But I mean, the chapel is tiny. I mean, it's super small, but it's just as much as what they need. And like with any church anywhere, like we have all these beautiful things to share with people. Like they have exactly what they need, but they also have all of the elements, all the beauty, all the architecture, like to share with people. I mean, driving up, I passed just south of the town. I like to the left. As I was coming, there's a big field, and there was a gigantic church, and it looked very, very old. And that's where I thought the monastery was, because it looked like there was a little like an old school building. And I'm like, oh, that's got to be it. I mean, that's big, grandiose, and beautiful. And then I pass it, and my phone doesn't tell me to turn in, and I keep going, and then I pull into the actual parking lot, and I'm like, oh, not at all what I was expecting. I mean, kind of run down. It's in the middle of like a woodsy area. Grass wasn't cut, and I'm like, it's endearing. I mean, it really is. It's so simple, but it had everything that they needed to share with people. Because I mean, I think about it. There's so many kids at that service. Blew my mind. I mean, the ratio of young people to old people, I'm saying like 50 or 60 and older, was probably like 2 to 1. I mean, their kids were all over the place. And, if that's what it takes to bring people in, then praise God for it. That's what we should do. That simplicity of life. Yeah.
And I think there's a beautiful line in the beginning of the Divine Liturgy where they're asked, it's kind of prayer intentions, and they say something to the effect of like, and for those, the medieval life is you have those who rule, the divisions are you have those who rule and those who work and those who pray. And so it's something to the effect of like, thank God for everyone who works so that we can sing. It's still like for those of us who sing. So kind of the idea in the monastery is, we aren't necessarily supposed to be useful. If that makes sense. Like, so like when people think of monasticism, they're like, oh, they pray a lot. And so they pray a lot and they make soap or something, right? So it's like, okay, cool. But like I've heard religious say something to the effect of like, our main goal isn't to pray for people. The main goal of me being a monastic, I'm not saying me, I'm saying this religious was saying this. The main point of me being monastic is for my salvation, right? It's to grow closer to God. It's a sign of repentance. And so I am moving away from everything that could lead me away from Christ. I'm setting that to the side, and I'm giving myself wholly to him. And so, of course, the monks do work, because those who don't work don't eat, as St. Paul says. So they brew coffee, and it's really good coffee. I have some of the coffee in my house now, and that's what they do. They pray and they work, they go to sleep, and they will do that until they die. And it's sort of like the love of money, the love of ambition, marriage, keeping house, keeping children. Those are beautiful things, but the monks set those aside in order to wholly focus on praying for themselves, for others, but mainly to live a life fully dedicated to Christ.
So this, because in my mind, both going into it, and I mean, apart from the fact that it was basically, at least the environment was a basically positive experience, but with the idea of monasticism, that's always been my question. I might have just gotten now what you've been saying for quite a while, Alex, in our behind the scenes conversations, that that this has to, so this basically has to do with the Catholic and Orthodox view of, do I say justification? That might get too on the nose. The spiritual life, the view of the spiritual life.
Yeah.
So I mean, because coming from my perspective, the idea of, if they're specifically saying we're not necessarily praying for people, then I think most of our non-Catholic listeners, especially in other denominations, their immediate thought might be, well, then what's the point of this? What good does this do for anyone?
Yeah.
So what's the maybe elaborate a little more on what the thought might be, why that's not true.
So the idea is that we're not supposed to be useful necessarily to ourselves or to others. We're supposed to be useful to God. God is our origin, our sustainer, and our final end. So the monastic calling is to live a life completely dedicated to God. Now, as married people, Eric and I, we live a life dedicated to God via our wives and via our spouses. And until you have kids, you live a life dedicated to God through maybe your work or your school, so on and so forth, right? The priest, in a very particular way, or the pastor, is dedicated his life to God through his congregation and through pastoral care, through the ministry of the life of the church building, the church community, his flock. But the monastic forgoes all of that and lives a life completely dedicated to God without any, with far less mediation, right? So, of course you have a commitment to your brothers and sisters in the monastery or in your community, in your religious tradition or whatever religious community you're a part of, whether you're Franciscan, Benedictine, Byzantine. But the main thing is saying you are living a life that is fully dedicated to the pursuit of God and God's operation in your soul. So that's the main idea, and nothing else is needed, and nothing else is needed to be sufficient for the end of monastic life. So it's a gift of the church. The monastic calling is a gift of the church, where the church says that you have this option to pursue this calling that puts you in a position where you can focus solely on prayer, fasting, and repentance. You can follow Christ when he said, sell everything and follow me. And you strip off all worldly adornment, ideally, and you say, here I am, Lord, and you go with him into the desert. And most of the time it's the desert of the soul. And so that's kind of the idea basically of how the monastic life plays into what it's for. It's not for anything, it's for God.
And this did, speaking of the desert, and maybe to give people a little bit of background historical context, this practice developed in the age of what they call the Desert Fathers, right?
Mm-hmm.
As I understand it, and this was coming from a secular historian, so take it for what it's worth in Christian analysis terms, but it was either, broadly speaking, it was kind of a John the Baptist style. It was all connected to when Emperor Constantine pivoted the whole history of Christianity by legalizing it and then endowing the church with enormous material wealth and status in society. And then 70 years after that, Theodosius both divided the empire and also made both halves of it legally Christian. Mm. Like it was the enforced religion of the empire for the first time. And in that context, if I'm remembering right, is where monasticism started to arise, because the institutionalized church now was kind of like Judaism in the first century when Christ came, was suffering what happens whenever you introduce the love of money in large amounts into any institution, and power and influence. It was decaying. And the early monastics, am I right? In more than anything, they were attempting to leave that and to show a better way to the culture.
Yeah, and it at first you had more of a practice of the hermit. So the hermit individually went off into the desert and lived his life of penance and fasting and prayer. And then you had over time the development of 2 monks, 3 monks, or 2 hermits, 4 hermits, 5 hermits, until they formed a bit of a band and a bit of community doing this together, right? And so in the West, it was Saint Benedict who took the idea of the single hermit, and he wrote the Rule of Saint Benedict, which in secular and religious history is kind of a staple point, moving away from the post-fall of the Roman Empire era into the dawn of what they call the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, right? So that's who made the switch and into the monastery is a bunch of hermits doing hermit stuff together, praying, fasting, all that sort of stuff. But the idea is the hermit idea, but also a return to the early church, where you are, living with everything in common. You are living a life completely dedicated to prayer. And if we can't get martyred in the streets and the Colosseum, we can martyr our flesh and thereby, step by step, grow in union with God. Because Christianity is legal now, so it was a progressive movement of history and church internal mechanics, that sort of stuff.
And that was the other point I'd read about, was that idea of what do we do now that martyrdom isn't really a thing anymore. So it was a combination of those two that brought it. And then obviously with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the eventual shrinking of the East, you had a situation in the West where wealth and power was no longer really a thing in the West, because the Roman infrastructure was gone and these little successor kingdoms were just battling each other in petty little feuds inside of the territory. Like you'd have 20 different warlords sometimes fighting inside of what was once one Roman province, with obvious impact upon the state of society, economically, socially, developmentally, knowledge-wise. So as you get into and go through sort of the fall and then re-emergence of the West, how did monasticism develop along with the rest of society?
Well, monasticism sort of became the last vestige of civilization, right? Especially the Benedictines, and there were offshoots of the Benedictines, but it was more of that bunker mentality, like you were talking about, but maybe not explicitly. The idea was, well, these are places that people think, and these are places where people eschew marriage, and these are places where people eschew titles. So this is kind of where the top tier of what was left of European civilization remained, because you had people who weren't really concerned with, getting land for themselves. Maybe they were concerned about getting land for the monastery, or they were concerned, it's like maybe they were concerned about becoming abbot of the monastery, but they weren't necessarily concerned with becoming lords. And so the monks were kind of separated from the feuding of the princes, and they were able to tend to the weary traveler, tend to reading, tend to writing, and of course all the other things attendant on the Christian life. So it was the monasteries that saved a lot of the knowledge of Western civilization. A lot of the manuscripts and a lot of the learning, a lot of medicine. And it was the monasteries that were the springboard for the modern educational system. So you hear about King Henry VIII dissolving the monasteries during, the Protestant Reformation. Well, that's because the monasteries, they were very, very wealthy. Maybe not the individual monks, but because they were civic centers and they were institutions of the community. There were a lot of them, number one, and number two, they had treasures, treasures upon treasures. And so in the dissolution of the monasteries, we can see how powerful these institutions had become in European society.
Okay, interesting. And I'm going to cliffhanger that, and we'll wrap up for this episode and resume in our next episode with bringing the story up to the modern day. So until then, this is Eric Slawick, aka the Pen Guy, and
Alex Burks,
and
Elliot School.
And we will see you next time.